My husband's lawyer called a family meeting 3 days after the funeral. His sister sneered at me. "He left nothing for you, old woman." Everyone laughed, but the lawyer slowly pushed a black box across the table toward me. "Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories." The laughter still echoes in my mind. Not the warm, loving laughter I'd heard for 45 years at family gatherings, but something cruel and sharp, like breaking glass. They sat around our dining room table, the same table where I'd served thousands of meals, and they laughed at me like I was nothing, like I had never existed at all. My name is Margaret Thompson, though for 45 years everyone simply called me Maggie. Robert was the only one who said it with love until his voice fell silent 3 days ago. I'm 68 years old now, with hands that show every year of hard work and a heart that somehow still believed in the goodness of family until that moment in the lawyer's office. When I met Robert, I was 23 and working at a diner downtown. He came in every morning at 6 sharp, ordering black coffee and wheat toast, his 3 young children trailing behind him like lost ducklings. Their mother had died 2 years earlier from cancer, and Robert was drowning in grief while trying to raise Victoria, Michael, and little Jennifer alone. Victoria was 8 then, angry at the world and especially at any woman who looked at her father. Michael was 6, quiet and withdrawn, hiding behind books bigger than his small hands could hold. Jennifer was only 4, still asking when Mommy was coming home. I never planned to fall in love with a widower and his broken family, but Robert's tired eyes held such kindness, and those children needed someone so desperately. Not just someone to cook and clean, but someone to hold them when nightmares came, to sit through school plays, to teach them that love doesn't end with death, but transforms into something else, something that helps you continue living. The first year was the hardest. Victoria refused to eat anything I cooked. Michael wouldn't speak to me for 3 months. Jennifer cried every time I tried to braid her hair differently than her mother had. But I stayed. I learned Victoria's favorite sandwich had no crusts and extra peanut butter. I discovered Michael would talk if I read his books first and asked him questions. I kept Jennifer's mother's photograph by her bed and told her stories about how brave she was. I worked 2 jobs those early years, days at the diner, nights cleaning offices, every penny going toward Robert's dream of starting his own construction company. I remember falling asleep standing up while stirring soup, waking with my head on Robert's shoulder as he gently took the spoon from my hand. "You don't have to do this," he'd whisper, but I did. Love isn't just words or feelings. Love is choosing to stay when leaving would be easier. Love is building something together, even when your hands are bleeding from the effort. By the time the children graduated high school, Robert's company had grown from 1 truck and a toolbox to the largest construction firm in the county. I watched Victoria walk across the medical school stage, knowing my night shifts had paid for her textbooks. I taught Michael to drive in our old station wagon, patient through every jerky stop and missed turn. I was the one who held Jennifer's hand in the bridal suite when her biological mother's family didn't come to her wedding. 45 years of choosing them every single day. And now they sat there laughing, calling me old woman, as if I was a stranger who'd wandered in by mistake. Life with Robert had settled into a rhythm as comfortable as breathing. Every morning at 5:45, I'd wake to the soft sound of him trying not to wake me as he got dressed, even though we both knew I'd been awake since he first stirred. By 6, we'd be on the back porch with our coffee, watching the sun paint the garden gold. Robert would sit in his father's old wooden chair, the one I'd reupholstered 3 times over the years, while I curled up on the swing he'd installed for our 10th anniversary. "Morning, beautiful," he'd say. The same greeting for 4 decades, his voice still making my heart skip like I was 23 again. We didn't need many words anymore. The comfortable silence between us held entire conversations. He'd reach over and take my hand when a cardinal landed on the bird feeder, knowing I considered them visits from my mother. I'd refill his coffee without being asked, adding just a splash of cream the way he'd started taking it 5 years ago when the doctor mentioned cholesterol. The garden was my sanctuary, but Robert treated it like sacred ground. He built raised beds when my knees started protesting, painted them soft blue because he knew it was my favorite color. Every spring he'd help me plant tomatoes, though he claimed to hate gardening. I'd catch him out there in the evenings, whispering to the plants like they were old friends, sneaking water to the peppers when he thought I wasn't looking. Our neighbors often joked that our vegetables grew so well because they were loved by two people instead of one. Sundays were for family, whether I wanted them to be or not. I'd start cooking at dawn, preparing enough food for 12 people. Sometimes more if Victoria decided to bring colleagues, or James showed up with his latest girlfriend. Pot roast that simmered for hours, mashed potatoes whipped with the mixer Robert bought me 30 years ago, green beans from our garden, rolls made from my grandmother's recipe. The dining room would fill with voices and laughter, though I noticed over the years how rarely anyone spoke directly to me except to ask for seconds or complain that something wasn't quite right. Robert always noticed, though. He'd squeeze my shoulder. As he passed, whisper, "Thank you," in my ear. Make sure to praise the meal loud enough for everyone to hear. "Maggie's the reason this family still gathers," he'd announce, raising his glass of sweet tea. "Without her, we'd all be eating TV dinners alone." The children would nod absently, already scrolling through their phones, but Robert's eyes would find mine across the table, holding a complete conversation in a glance. Evenings belonged to us. After dinner, after the dishes were done and the house settled into quiet, we'd take our walk. Same route for 15 years. Down Maple Street around the park where Michael learned to ride a bike, past the church where Jennifer got married, back up Oak Avenue as the streetlights flickered on. Robert's hand in mine, steady and warm, his thumb rubbing small circles on my palm when we passed the cemetery where his first wife rested. "When I retire next year," he'd say, the same promise he'd been making for 5 years. "We're going to see those northern lights you've always dreamed about. Maybe take that cruise through Alaska. Would you like that, Maggie?" I'd smile and nod, knowing he'd never fully retire, that his company was his other child, but loving him for the dreaming anyway. The last normal evening, he kissed me goodnight and said, "You know you're everything to me, right? Everything that matters." I thought it was just Robert being sentimental. I didn't know it was goodbye. It started 2 weeks before Robert's heart attack, subtle changes that seemed meaningless at the time. I noticed his study door was closed more often, and I could hear muffled phone conversations that ended abruptly when I knocked. Robert had always conducted business from his home office, but something felt different. The calls came at odd hours, sometimes past 10 at night, and his voice carried a tension I hadn't heard since the early days when we were fighting to keep the company afloat. The first time I saw his lawyer's car in our driveway on a Tuesday afternoon, I thought nothing of it. Harold Brennan had been Robert's attorney for 20 years, handling contracts and occasional disputes. But when I brought them coffee and Robert's favorite oatmeal cookies, they stopped talking mid-sentence. Papers were quickly shuffled and turned face down. Harold couldn't meet my eyes, just mumbled a thank you and stared at his coffee cup like it held the secrets of the universe. "Everything all right?" I asked Robert later that evening while we prepared dinner together. He was chopping carrots, the knife moving slower than usual, his mind clearly elsewhere. "Just some complicated contracts, Maggie. Nothing to worry about." But his smile didn't reach his eyes, and he changed the subject immediately, asking about my volunteer schedule at the church. Robert never asked about my volunteering unless he was trying to distract me from something. Then came the visits from James. Robert's younger brother had always been around, but suddenly, he was appearing 3 times a week, always during my regular volunteer shifts at the food bank. Mrs. Peterson from next door mentioned seeing James's Mercedes in our driveway every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. "Like clockwork," she said, her eyebrows raised with the kind of curiosity that had earned her the neighborhood gossip crown. "Always leaves right before you get home, dear." I found it odd but tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were planning something for our upcoming anniversary. 45 years was worth celebrating, and Robert did love his grand gestures. But then I noticed other things. Robert had started taking documents from his study to the bedroom, reading them late into the night with his reading glasses perched on his nose, his forehead creased with worry. When I'd wake and ask what kept him up, he'd quickly fold the papers and tuck them into his nightstand drawer, the one that suddenly had a lock on it. One morning, I was bringing fresh towels to his study when I overheard him on the phone. His voice was strained, almost angry, which was so unlike my Robert, who rarely raised his voice even when the children had tested every ounce of his patience during their teenage years. "She can never know about this, not until it's done," he said firmly. "It would break her heart, and I won't have her final memories of me tainted by this mess." A pause then. "I don't care what it costs. Just make sure everything is ironclad. They've taken enough." My hands trembled as I stood frozen in the hallway. Who couldn't know what? What would break my heart? Who had taken enough? I backed away quietly, my mind racing. Robert had faced business challenges before, but he'd always shared them with me. We were partners in everything, or so I thought. The towels dropped from my hands as I retreated to our bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed we'd shared for decades, trying to make sense of words that felt like strangers in my husband's voice. That night, Robert held me closer than usual, his arms wrapped around me like he was trying to memorize the feeling. "I love you, Maggie," he whispered into the darkness. "Whatever happens, remember that you were the best thing that ever happened to me." I should have asked him then what was wrong. I should have pushed for answers. Instead, I held him back and whispered that I loved him too, letting the moment pass, not knowing it was one of our last. I became an expert at explaining away every strange occurrence. The mind has a remarkable ability to protect the heart from truths it isn't ready to face. Each odd behavior, each secretive phone call, each locked drawer became a piece of a puzzle I was deliberately assembling wrong, creating a picture I could live with rather than the one actually taking shape before me. Our 45th anniversary was only 6 weeks away. Of course, Robert was being secretive. He'd surprised me for our 25th with a vow renewal ceremony, flying in my sister from Oregon, without telling me. For our 40th, he'd somehow tracked down the exact model of the car my father had taught me to drive in, completely restored, sitting in our driveway with a giant red bow. The man lived for surprising me, for seeing my face light up when he'd pulled off something spectacular. This was just Robert being Robert, I told myself every night as I lay beside him, feeling the distance between us even as our bodies touched. When I found him in his study at 3 a.m, surrounded by financial documents, I convinced myself he was planning something big. Maybe he was finally going to retire and was calculating whether we could afford that year-long travel adventure we'd dreamed about since we were young. The calculator, the spreadsheets, the way he quickly minimized the computer screen when I walked in, it all pointed to retirement planning. That's what I told myself as I brought him warm milk and rubbed his shoulders, feeling the tension that had taken up permanent residence there. "You're working too hard," I said, pressing my thumbs into the knots along his spine. "Whatever you're planning, honey, we don't need anything fancy. Just being together is enough." He reached back and caught my hand, bringing it to his lips. "Some things need to be perfect, Maggie. You deserve perfect." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, but I attributed it to exhaustion. Robert had always pushed himself too hard, always trying to prove he was worthy of love, as if 45 years hadn't already proven that 1,000 times over. The locked nightstand drawer became my personal Mount Everest of denial. It was probably anniversary gifts, I reasoned. Jewelry, maybe tickets to somewhere special. I even joked about it one morning, tapping the drawer playfully. "Keeping secrets from me, Mr. Thompson." Robert's face went pale for a moment before he forced a laugh. "Can't a man maintain some mystery after all these years?" But his hand shook slightly as he turned the key, making sure it was secure. When Victoria called, asking strange questions about our joint assets, I brushed it off as her being protective. She was a doctor, after all, analytical by nature. "Just making sure you and Dad have everything in order for the future," she said, her tone oddly formal. "You know, power of attorney, medical directives, all that important stuff." It seemed responsible, the kind of thing a daughter should ask about when her parents were getting older. I didn't question why she'd never shown such interest before. Even when I walked into the kitchen and found Robert and James huddled over documents, their voices dying immediately upon my entrance, I found an explanation. James was probably helping with the anniversary plans. Brothers should be close like that. The way James couldn't meet my eyes, the way Robert's hands trembled as he gathered the papers, it was just them being bad at keeping secrets. Men were terrible at surprise planning. I actually smiled about it, thinking how sweet it was that they were trying so hard. My friend Carol asked me at church if everything was all right. "Robert seems distracted lately," she said gently, "and you seem worried." I laughed it off, told her about the anniversary coming up, made it sound like I was in on some wonderful secret. The lie came so easily because I needed it to be true. The alternative, that something was actually wrong, that Robert was keeping something painful from me, was impossible to consider. Robert's heart attack came on a Thursday morning. One moment he was reaching for his coffee cup, the next he was clutching his chest, his face gray as winter sky. The ambulance, the hospital, the terrible waiting room with its fluorescent lights and smell of disinfectant, it all blurred together. 3 hours later he was gone. My Robert, who'd promised we'd have another 20 years at least, who just that morning kissed my forehead and said he'd see me for lunch, was gone. The house felt wrong without him. Every room held his absence like a physical thing. His coffee cup still sat on the kitchen counter where he'd left it. His reading glasses rested on yesterday's newspaper, marking an article about the county fair we'd never attend together. I moved through the days like a ghost myself, family members flowing in and out, making arrangements, speaking in hushed voices. Victoria took charge of everything with her usual efficiency, barely looking at me as she ordered flowers and chose hymns. It was 5 days after the funeral when I finally entered our bedroom to begin the impossible task of sorting through Robert's things. The church charity drive was coming up, and I thought Robert would want his clothes to go to men who needed them. His suits still smelled like his cologne, that subtle cedar scent I'd bought him every Christmas for 30 years. I pressed my face into his favorite blue jacket, the one he wore to Jennifer's wedding, and let myself cry until my legs gave out. That's when I found it. The jacket pocket crinkled when I fell against it. Inside was a bank statement from First National, but not from our joint account. This was something else entirely. Account holder Robert Thompson, just Robert. The account had been opened 6 months ago. Initial deposit of $3,800,000. My hands shook as I read the withdrawal history. Systematic transfers, 100,000 here, 200,000 there, all going to an account number I didn't recognize. The current balance, 47,832. $3 million. We'd lived comfortably but carefully. We'd saved and invested wisely, but $3 million in a separate account? Where had it come from? And more importantly, where had it gone? At the bottom of the statement, paper clipped to the back, was a handwritten note in Robert's careful script. The paper was worn, like he'd folded and unfolded it many times. "For when the truth comes out, forgive me, Maggie." I sank to the floor, my mind racing. Forgive him for what? What truth? The room spun as I tried to make sense of it. This wasn't anniversary planning. This wasn't retirement funds. This was something else, something Robert had hidden from me completely. The man who'd shared every thought, every dream, every fear with me for 45 years had kept a massive secret. I searched through his other jacket pockets with trembling fingers, finding business cards for lawyers I'd never heard of, not Harold Brennan, who'd handled Robert's affairs for decades. These were estate lawyers, forensic accountants, private investigators. One card had a phone number written on the back and the words, "They know. Move quickly," in Robert's handwriting. In his dresser, beneath carefully folded sweaters, I discovered a folder marked Evidence in red ink. Inside were printed emails between Victoria, Michael, and James. My eyes blurred as I read their words discussing the old woman, Dad's bleeding heart, and what we deserve. There were photographs of James at the bank, timestamps visible, records of property transfers I'd never authorized. My stepchildren and brother-in-law had been planning something, and Robert had known. The man I'd trusted with everything had been fighting a battle he'd never told me about, and now he was gone, leaving me with only fragments of truth and a note asking for forgiveness. I sat surrounded by evidence of betrayal, not sure if the greater pain was from those who'd plotted against me or from the husband who'd faced it alone. The law office of Harold Brennan sat on Main Street, its mahogany doors and brass nameplate speaking of old money and older traditions. I'd dressed carefully that morning, wearing the black dress Robert had loved, the pearl necklace he'd given me for our 30th anniversary. My hands didn't shake anymore. The tears had dried. I walked into that room like a widow should, dignified and quiet, while inside my heart was breaking into pieces so small I wondered if I'd ever be whole again. They were all there already, arranged around the conference table like vultures who'd already decided how to divide the corpse. Victoria sat at the head, her designer suit impeccable, her doctor's hands folded with practiced precision. She'd inherited Robert's strong jaw, but none of his kindness. Michael lounged in his chair, scrolling through his phone, barely glancing up when I entered. Jennifer at least had the decency to look uncomfortable, fidgeting with her wedding ring, the one I'd helped Robert pick out for her husband to give her. James dominated the space beside them, his expensive cologne failing to mask the smell of his greed. His latest girlfriend, someone half his age named Brittany or Bethany, examined her manicure with intense focus. They all looked at me when I entered, and for the first time in 45 years, I saw myself through their eyes. The servant who'd outlived her usefulness, the interloper who'd somehow managed to stay too long. Harold Brennan looked deeply uncomfortable as he opened his briefcase. "Thank you all for coming. I need to inform you that Robert made significant changes to his will 6 months ago." He pulled out a document and I noticed his hands trembling slightly. This man who'd been at our wedding, who'd celebrated our anniversaries with us, couldn't meet my eyes. "Finally," Victoria said, her voice sharp with satisfaction. "Dad came to his senses." Harold began reading in a monotone voice, as if distance from the words could somehow minimize their cruelty. "To my daughter, Victoria Thompson Hayes, I leave my shares in Thompson Construction, valued at approximately $2 million. Victoria's smile was triumphant. "To my son, Michael Thompson, the commercial properties on Riverside Avenue and Oak Street, valued at $1.5 million. Michael finally looked up from his phone. "To my daughter, Jennifer Thompson Martinez, the vacation home in Lake Tahoe and associated assets." Then Harold paused, his discomfort visible. "To my brother, James Thompson, I leave the remainder of my liquid assets and investments to be distributed as he sees fit." James leaned back in his chair, satisfaction radiating from every pore. "Margaret Thompson is to receive personal effects and may remain in the family home for 30 days to make arrangements for alternative accommodation." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Victoria laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. "Personal effects. How appropriate. Dad always was too generous with the help." "He left nothing for you, old woman," James added, his sneer revealing the ugliness that expensive dental work couldn't hide. 45 years, and in the end, Robert knew exactly what you were worth. Nothing." The room erupted in laughter. Not nervous laughter or embarrassed laughter, but genuine amusement at my humiliation. Michael actually high-fived his uncle. Jennifer covered her mouth, but her eyes danced with mirth. Even the girlfriend giggled behind her manicured nails. "You played a good game," Victoria said, wiping tears of laughter from her eyes. "Making Dad think you loved him. But blood is what matters. We're his real family. You were just, what's the word? Temporary." "A 45-year temporary arrangement," Michael added, finally engaged enough to pile on. "That's dedication. I'll give you that." "Dad told us everything before he died," Jennifer said quietly, but her words cut deeper than the other's cruelty. "How you trapped him after Mom died. How he felt obligated to stay with you. He said changing the will was the only way to make things right." Harold Brennan shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. The lawyer who'd witnessed our love story from the beginning sat silent as they rewrote history, painting me as a calculating gold digger who'd preyed on a grieving widower. I wanted to scream that I'd worked 2 jobs to help build that company, that I'd raised these children when their own mother's family wouldn't help, that every dollar they were inheriting had my sweat and sacrifice mixed into it. Instead, I sat perfectly still as Harold pushed a folder across the table. "These are the papers you need to sign, acknowledging receipt of the will's contents and agreeing to the 30-day vacation of premises." That's when I saw it, partially hidden beneath the folder, a black velvet box, the kind that usually held jewelry. Harold's eyes met mine for the first time, and something flickered there. He slowly, deliberately pushed the box toward me, separate from the papers. I took the black box home without opening it, my hand steady despite the earthquake in my chest. The house felt like a mausoleum, every room echoing with absence and betrayal. I sat at Robert's desk, the box before me like a coiled snake, afraid of what truth might spring out when I lifted the lid. The folder of evidence I'd found earlier lay beside it, those emails and photographs now taking on new meaning. When I finally opened the box, my breath caught. Inside was a USB drive, a small key, and a business card for Martin Chen, forensic accountant. Written on the back in Robert's handwriting, "Maggie, call him immediately. He has everything. Trust no one else." Beneath these items was a photograph that made my blood run cold. It showed James at First National Bank, clearly visible through the window, sitting at a desk with bank documents spread before him. But the timestamp showed 2:47 p.m., January 18th, 2 days after Robert's death. After. James had been at the bank after Robert died. I called Martin Chen with shaking fingers. His voice was gentle but urgent. "Mrs. Thompson, I've been expecting your call. Can you come to my office tonight? Bring the USB drive. Tell no one." His office was in a building 30 miles away, deliberately far from anyone who might recognize me. Martin Chen was younger than I expected, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He inserted the USB drive into his computer and turned the screen toward me. "Your husband hired me 6 months ago when he discovered something disturbing. I'm sorry for what you're about to learn." The files opened like Pandora's box. Financial records showing James had been siphoning money from Thompson Construction for 8 years. False invoices, phantom employees, inflated supply costs, all funneling back to accounts James controlled. The total, nearly $4 million. Robert had discovered it during a routine audit, had confronted James privately, trying to handle it as family. "But that's just the beginning," Martin said, opening another folder. "When Robert confronted him, James didn't just confess. He made threats." There were recordings. Robert had been wearing a wire. James's voice filled the office, cold and calculating. "You expose me and I'll destroy everything. I know about Chicago, Robert. I know what really happened to Carl Mitchell. One word from me and your reputation, your company, everything you built goes up in flames. Your precious Maggie will be left with nothing but shame." My hand flew to my mouth. Carl Mitchell. 20 years ago, Robert's former business partner had died in a construction accident in Chicago. It had been investigated, ruled an accident, but it had haunted Robert. He'd paid for Carl's children's education, taken care of his widow until she remarried. Now James was implying something sinister. "It was still an accident," Martin assured me quickly. "I investigated thoroughly, but James had manufactured evidence to make it look like negligence, even murder. Photoshopped safety reports, falsified witness statements, enough to destroy Robert's reputation even if legally proven false. The scandal alone would have ruined everything. The conspiracy went deeper. Victoria, Michael, and Jennifer had known about the embezzlement for 2 years. James had bought their silence with promises of larger inheritances. They'd been receiving monthly payments from the stolen funds, listed as consulting fees, for the company they never actually worked for. Jennifer's house, Victoria's medical practice startup costs, Michael's failed business ventures, all funded by money stolen from their father. But here's what changes everything, Martin said, pulling up bank records. The will that was read to you? Your husband never signed it. Look at this footage from the bank's security system. He clicked play, and there was James, 2 days after Robert's death, using a signature stamp he'd stolen from Robert's office. The real will was in a safety deposit box, the key I now held in my trembling hand. Your husband knew he was sick, Martin said gently. His heart condition was worse than anyone knew. He spent his last months gathering evidence, protecting you. He said you'd been protected your whole marriage, and he wasn't going to stop just because he was dying. The room spun as I realized the magnitude of what Robert had done. He'd let them think they'd won, knowing that their arrogance would make them sloppy. Every cruel word they'd said to me, every laugh, every sneer, they'd been building their own prosecution. And Robert, even in death, had been protecting me, gathering the evidence that would bring them all down. I drove home in a daze, Martin Chen's revelations churning in my mind like poison. The house was dark when I arrived, and I didn't bother turning on the lights. I collapsed in Robert's chair in his study, the leather still holding the shape of him, still smelling faintly of his cologne and the peppermints he always kept in his pocket. The evidence of my life's deception spread across his desk like a morgue photo of my marriage. The sobs came suddenly, violently, 45 years of love and sacrifice erupting from my chest in sounds I didn't recognize as human. I cried for the young woman who'd fallen in love with a widower, believing she could heal his broken family. I cried for every night I'd worked double shifts, my feet swollen and back aching, telling myself it was worth it because we were building something together. I cried for the fool who'd believed she was loved. The memories came in waves, each one a fresh wound. Victoria's first day of high school when I'd stayed up all night sewing her dress because she'd torn it and was too embarrassed to ask for a new one. She'd walked past me that morning without a word of thanks, but Robert had kissed my forehead and said, "She loves you, Maggie. She just doesn't know how to show it." Lies. All lies. I remembered Michael's graduation from college, how I'd sold my mother's china to help pay for his final semester when Robert's company hit a rough patch. Michael had hugged me that day, called me Mom for the first and only time. Now I knew he'd already been taking James's bribes, already seeing me as the obstacle to his inheritance. That hug had been strategy, not love. Jennifer's wedding flooded back, how I'd spent 3 months hand-beating her veil because she'd seen one in a magazine we couldn't afford. Her biological mother's family had refused to come, and I'd held her while she cried in the bridal suite, promising her she was loved, she was wanted, she was ours. "You're the only real mother I've ever had," she'd said through her tears. Another performance, another lie. I stumbled to our bedroom, Robert's pillow still on his side of the bed, still indented from his head. I pressed my face into it and screamed until my throat was raw. How could he have known all of this and said nothing? How could he have let me serve them dinner, wash their clothes, celebrate their birthdays, knowing they were thieves and conspirators? How could he have left me to face this alone? "You bastard," I sobbed into his pillow. "You coward, you knew, and you left me here with nothing but evidence and enemies. 45 years, Robert. 45 years of my life, and you couldn't trust me with the truth?" I raged through the house, our wedding photos mocking me from every wall. There we were, young and hopeful, believing love could conquer everything. There were the children at various ages, me always in the background, the devoted stepmother, the willing fool. I wanted to smash every frame, burn every memory, erase every moment of the life I'd thought I was living. The photo album from our last anniversary broke me completely. Robert had made it himself, documenting our life together. His handwritten notes beneath each photo: Maggie teaching Victoria to drive, Patience of a Saint. Maggie, at Michael's graduation. She thinks I didn't see her cry. Maggie and Jennifer baking Christmas cookies. The glue that holds us together. The glue that holds us together. I laughed bitterly through my tears. Glue is meant to be invisible, useful only until something stronger comes along. Then it's scraped away and forgotten. That's all I'd ever been, invisible adhesive, holding together people who were planning my disposal. I lay on our bedroom floor until dawn, empty of tears, empty of everything. The woman who'd entered that lawyer's office yesterday was gone. The devoted stepmother, the loving wife, the patient saint. She'd died with the truth. What remained was someone I didn't recognize, someone who'd been sleeping while her life was stolen piece by piece. But as the sun rose, painting the room in harsh light, something else stirred in the emptiness. Not hope, not yet, but something harder, sharper. The first spark of fury that would become my resurrection. Dawn light crept across the bedroom floor where I still lay, my body stiff from a night spent on cold hardwood. My throat was raw from crying, my eyes swollen shut. But as I pushed myself up, something had changed. The paralysis of grief was giving way to something else, something I'd never felt before in 68 years of turning the other cheek. I stood slowly, catching my reflection in Robert's dresser mirror. The woman staring back looked like a stranger. Hair wild, face blotched and aged 10 years in one night. But the eyes were different. They weren't the soft, patient eyes of Maggie the caregiver. They were harder, clearer, like steel that had been tempered in fire. I walked to Robert's closet and pushed aside his suits, reaching for the safe I'd pretended not to know about for 20 years. The combination was our anniversary date, because even in his secrets, Robert was sentimental. Inside, beneath insurance papers and bonds, was an envelope with my name written in his shaking hand. I'd missed it when I'd found the other evidence, too overwhelmed to search thoroughly. The letter inside was dated 1 week before his death. My dearest Maggie, if you're reading this, then I've failed to protect you the way I promised I would 45 years ago. I know you've discovered the truth by now, and I know you're angry with me for keeping it from you. You have every right to be. I found out about James's theft 8 years ago. I should have called the police immediately, but he was family and I was weak. I thought I could handle it quietly. Then I discovered the children were involved, and my shame grew too large to share, even with you, especially with you. You loved them, Maggie. You loved them when their own blood didn't. You sacrificed everything for children who were plotting against you, and I couldn't bear to be the one to tell you. I kept thinking I could fix it, make them see what they were throwing away. I was a fool, but I wasn't a fool about one thing: choosing you. You were never temporary, my darling. You were the only real thing in a family built on lies. Every morning with coffee on the porch, every evening walk, every moment you thought I wasn't watching, I was memorizing you, storing up enough love to last whatever comes next. The black box has everything you need. Martin Chen has my real will, properly witnessed, legally bulletproof. The USB drive contains 8 years of evidence. The photograph of James at the bank after my death is your proof of fraud. They think they've won, but I've been planning this for 6 months. You were always the strongest one, Maggie. I was just too selfish to let you carry this burden while I was alive. But now you must fight. Not for me. I don't deserve it. But for you. For the woman who gave everything and asked for nothing. For the 1,000 meals you cooked for people who didn't deserve your salt. for every sacrifice that was taken for granted. They'll underestimate you. They always have. They see a gentle old woman who'll go quietly into poverty. Show them the steel I've always known was there. Show them what happens when you corner someone who has nothing left to lose and everything to prove. All my love. Always. Robert P.S. Check our wedding album. The backup evidence is hidden in the spine. They'll never think to look there. I set the letter down with steady hands. No more tears came. Robert was right. They would underestimate me. They saw a servant, a doormat, a foolish old woman who'd spent 45 years being grateful for scraps of affection. They didn't see the girl who'd survived poverty, who'd worked herself bloody to build a life, who'd raised 3 ungrateful children with patience that was strength, not weakness. I walked to the kitchen and made coffee, strong and black, the way Robert had taught me to drink it when we were young and couldn't afford cream. I sat on the porch in his chair, watching the sun rise over the garden we'd built together, and began to plan. They wanted to take everything from me. They'd already taken what mattered most, my faith in the family I'd created. But that loss had freed me from something too, from the need to protect them, to keep the peace, to be the bigger person. You want a war? I said to the morning air, to Robert's ghost, to the universe that had let this happen. You've got one. The gentle stepmother was dead. What rose from her ashes was something far more dangerous. A woman with nothing to lose, evidence to use, and 45 years of suppressed rage finally given permission to burn. I spent the next 3 days becoming someone I'd never been, calculating, methodical, ruthless. The kitchen table where I'd served thousands of family meals became my war room. Legal pads covered its surface, each one filled with timelines, financial records, and a step-by-step plan that would dismantle their conspiracy piece by piece. First, I hired Catherine Walsh, the most feared estate attorney in the state. She was everything I wasn't, sharp-edged, cold-eyed, and utterly without mercy. Her retainer would take my mother's jewelry and most of my personal savings, but when I showed her the evidence, her shark smile made it worth every penny. They committed fraud, embezzlement, and elder abuse, she said, her voice like honey over broken glass. By the time I'm done with them, they'll be begging you for forgiveness from federal prison. She paused, studying me. Most people would want to settle quietly, family and all that. Family? I laughed, and the sound was bitter as burnt coffee. Family died with my husband. These are just thieves who happen to share his blood. Catherine's smile widened. I'm going to enjoy working with you, Mrs. Thompson. Together, we crafted the trap. Martin Chen had discovered something crucial. James had been sloppy in his arrogance. The bank transfers he'd made after Robert's death weren't just fraud. They'd crossed state lines, making it a federal crime. The FBI would be very interested in 8 years of embezzlement records, especially with the fraudulent will as evidence of an ongoing conspiracy. But I wanted more than legal justice. I wanted them to feel what I'd felt in that lawyer's office. Complete humiliation, the realization that everything they thought they'd won was turning to ash in their hands. Catherine suggested a family meeting, ostensibly for me to sign away my rights to any future claims. Let them think you're beaten, she advised. The documents they'll want you to sign will be their confession. Every paper they push across that table will be evidence of their conspiracy. I called Harold Brennan, my voice deliberately shaky and defeated. I'll sign whatever they want, I told him. I just want this to be over, but I'd like to do it properly with everyone there to witness it. One last family gathering. Harold agreed too quickly, relief evident in his voice. Within hours, Victoria called, her tone triumphant. Smart choice, Margaret. We'll make this quick and painless. Well, relatively painless. She laughed at her own joke. I spent the next week preparing for the performance of my life. I practiced looking broken, defeated, moving slowly like grief had aged me decades. I wore Robert's old cardigan, the one with the hole in the elbow I'd always meant to mend, knowing they'd see it as proof of my poverty. But underneath, I was steel in preparation. The real will was now in Catherine's possession, properly authenticated. The FBI had been notified and would be monitoring the meeting through recording devices Catherine had legally arranged. Every document they'd present would be forensically analyzed. Martin Chen would be there, disguised as Catherine's assistant, ready to verify the financial fraud in real time. I also made copies of everything: 8 years of embezzlement records, the photographs of James at the bank after Robert's death, recordings of his threats, evidence of the children's involvement, USB drives hidden in my jacket, clouds uploads to 3 different services, hard copies in Catherine's safe. If they tried to destroy evidence, it would resurface like a hydra. But the masterstroke was the guest list. I contacted extended family members, Robert's business partners, their church friends, neighbors who'd watched the children grow up. One last gathering, I told them sadly, to say goodbye properly before I move away. 30 people confirmed they'd come to support me in my grief. The stage was set. They thought they were coming to watch me sign my surrender. Instead, they'd be walking into their own public execution. The meek stepmother they'd laughed at was gone. In her place stood someone they'd never suspected existed. A woman who'd learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't served cold, it's served with an audience. The morning of the meeting, I stood in front of the mirror applying lipstick with steady hands. Not the neutral pink I'd worn for 45 years, but red, the color of blood and war. I'd chosen my outfit carefully, the simple black dress from Robert's funeral, but underneath it, I wore my armor of evidence and truth. The recording device Catherine had given me was pinned inside my collar like a secret talisman. The dining room had been transformed. The table extended with all its leaves, 40 places set with my best china, the crystal glasses Robert had bought for our 25th anniversary, catching the light like frozen tears. I'd cooked nothing. Let them wonder why the woman who'd fed them for decades hadn't prepared a final meal. The emptiness of those plates would speak louder than any feast. They arrived early, of course. Victoria swept in first, designer heels clicking against hardwood like a countdown. "Quite the production, Margaret," she said, eyeing the extended table. "Bit much for signing papers, don't you think?" "I wanted witnesses," I replied softly, keeping my eyes downcast, so there could be no questions later. Michael and James arrived together, thick as the thieves they were. James carried a leather portfolio, no doubt containing the documents they expected me to sign. He patted it like a pet. "Smart woman, Maggie. No point fighting the inevitable." Jennifer came last, unable to meet my eyes, clutching her husband Tom's arm. At least she had the decency to look uncomfortable. Tom, who'd always been kind to me, looked confused by the tension in the room. He didn't know. Jennifer had kept him in the dark about their conspiracy. That would change today. One by one, the others arrived. Robert's cousins from Maine, his elderly Aunt Dorothy, who'd taught me her secret pie crust recipe, business partners who'd watched Robert build his company from nothing. The church ladies came in a group, their faces sympathetic, believing they were here to support a grieving widow. Our neighbors, the Petersons and the Johnsons, who'd shared 30 years of barbecues and borrowed sugar. Each arrival made Victoria's face tighter, James's smile more forced. "What is this?" James hissed, pulling me aside. "You said you were signing the papers." "I am," I replied meekly, "but I wanted everyone who knew Robert to witness the end of my time with your family. Closure, you understand." Harold Brennan arrived looking deeply uncomfortable, followed by a young woman with a court reporter's stenotype machine. "For the legal record," he mumbled when Victoria questioned her presence. He didn't mention that Catherine Walsh had demanded that every word spoken today would be legally documented. The room filled with the murmur of voices, old friends catching up, unaware they were about to witness a massacre. I moved among them like a ghost, accepting condolences, letting them see my supposedly broken state. But I was counting down, watching the door, waiting. At exactly 2 o'clock, Catherine Walsh entered with Martin Chen. The room fell silent at the sight of her. This infamous attorney whose presence meant someone was about to be destroyed. She moved through the crowd like a blade through silk, her assistant rolling a small suitcase behind them. The kind that might contain evidence or documents or someone's complete ruin. What the hell is she doing here? James stood abruptly, his face flushing red. Mrs. Thompson asked me to review the documents before signing, Catherine said smoothly, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. Surely you have no objection to legal counsel being present. Unless, of course, there's something in these documents you'd prefer wasn't examined too closely. Victoria's hands clenched around her phone. Michael shifted nervously. Jennifer had gone pale as parchment. The family friends watched with growing interest, sensing drama they hadn't expected. Dorothy leaned forward, her 90-year-old eyes sharp as ever. Catherine nodded to me, and I walked to my place at the head of the table, Robert's chair, where I'd never sat before. The moment had come. 45 years of silence were about to end, and the sound would be deafening. Before we begin, I said, my voice stronger than anyone had ever heard it, Harold, would you please distribute the papers they want me to sign? I think everyone should see exactly what Robert's family expects me to agree to. The trap was set. Now to spring it. Harold reluctantly passed around copies of the documents, his hands trembling. The room grew quiet as people read, gasps of disbelief rippling through the crowd. The papers didn't just strip me of everything. They included a clause where I admitted to undue influence over Robert, essentially confessing to being a gold digger who'd manipulated a grieving widower for 45 years. This is disgusting, Dorothy said loudly, her aged voice cutting through the silence. Robert would roll over in his grave. Robert's wishes are clearly stated in his will, Victoria said coldly. He saw the truth before he died. That's when Catherine stood, opening her briefcase with theatrical precision. Speaking of truth, Mrs. Thompson, I believe you have something to show everyone? I pulled out the black velvet box, my hand steady as stone. Robert left me this, just this one thing. I opened it slowly, pulling out the photograph that had made everything clear. This is James at First National Bank, January 18th at 2:47 p.m. Robert died on January 16th. I held it up, letting everyone see clearly. This photograph shows James using a signature stamp to forge documents 2 days after my husband's death. The will you're all referring to? Robert never signed it. James shot to his feet. That's ridiculous. You can't prove— Actually, we can, Martin Chen interrupted, pulling out his laptop. The bank's security footage, which I've authenticated and provided to the FBI, shows everything. Mr. James Thompson forging not just the will, but also the transfer documents moving $3 million from Mr. Robert Thompson's private account. FBI? Michael's voice cracked like a teenager's. Catherine smiled, that shark smile I'd paid dearly for. Oh yes, you see, transferring stolen funds across state lines is a federal crime. Wire fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse. The list is quite extensive. She pulled out a USB drive and plugged it into Martin's laptop, projecting onto the wall behind me. But wait, there's more. Robert's voice filled the room, clear and strong even in death. The recording from his wire played James's threats, his admission of embezzlement, his blackmail about Carl Mitchell. The room listened in stunned silence as 8 years of theft unfolded in my husband's carefully documented evidence. You were stealing from him, Tom said, staring at his wife in horror. Jennifer, you knew about this. Jennifer burst into tears, but Catherine wasn't finished. She produced bank records showing monthly payments to all 3 children, labeled as consulting fees for work never performed. Tax fraud as well, she noted clinically. The IRS will be very interested. But the killing blow was yet to come. I stood, pulling out the real will from the portfolio I'd hidden under the table. This is Robert's actual will, properly witnessed, notarized, and filed with the state 3 months ago. I began to read, in a clear voice. To my beloved wife, Margaret Thompson, I leave the entirety of my estate, with the following exceptions. To my brother, James Thompson, I leave the sum of $1 and a promise not to prosecute if he confesses to his crimes. To my children, Victoria, Michael, and Jennifer, I leave the same, $1 each, and my deepest disappointment. The room erupted. James lunged for the will, but 2 FBI agents who'd been posing as Catherine's assistants stepped forward, badges flashing. James Thompson, you're under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit fraud. As they cuffed him, James fell to his knees, the photograph dropping from my hand to land in front of him. His face crumbled as he realized Robert had planned this all, had known about the fake will before it was even created, had let them hang themselves with their own greed. Dad knew? Victoria whispered, her composure finally cracking. He knew everything, I said quietly. Every theft, every lie, every cruel word you said about me when you thought I couldn't hear. He documented it all. He protected me even in death, which is more than any of you ever did in life. Michael tried to run, but an agent blocked his path. Jennifer collapsed into Tom's arms, sobbing that she was sorry, that James had threatened them, that they never meant for it to go this far. But her husband pushed her away, disgust clear on his face. The room of witnesses sat in stunned silence, watching the family that had mocked me, humiliated me, tried to destroy me, being led away in handcuffs. Dorothy was the first to speak, her voice filled with satisfaction. Now that's the Maggie I always knew was in there. The courtroom. Battles lasted 6 months, but the outcome was never in doubt. James received 15 years in federal prison for embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy. The judge, a stern woman who reminded me of my grandmother, called his actions a particularly heinous betrayal of familial trust. James aged 10 years and 10 seconds when she read the sentence. His assets were seized, including the house he'd bought with stolen money and the Mercedes he'd loved more than people. Victoria's medical license was suspended pending investigation. The state medical board couldn't ignore fraud charges, even if they weren't directly related to her practice. Her husband filed for divorce within a month, taking their children, unwilling to have them raised by someone who could steal from family. She lost her practice, her reputation crumbling like old paper. The last I heard, she was working as a medical consultant from a small apartment. Her designer clothes sold to pay legal fees. Michael's business partners discovered his involvement and immediately severed ties. Without their support, and with his assets frozen, his company collapsed within weeks. His wife stayed, surprisingly, but they moved to another state to escape the shame. He works construction now, the irony not lost on anyone, doing the kind of manual labor he'd always looked down on his father for starting with. Jennifer's story broke my heart the most despite everything. Tom divorced her but fought for her in court, testifying that she'd been the most reluctant conspirator, that James had threatened to ruin them if she didn't comply. She received probation and community service instead of jail time. She sent me a letter, pages of apologies and tears, claiming she'd wanted to tell me so many times. I read it once, then burned it in the fireplace. Some wounds don't heal with words. The money was recovered, most of it anyway. $3 million returned, plus the estate Robert had actually left me. I kept the house, our house, but it felt different now. Emptier, but somehow cleaner, like opening windows after a long illness. I had the dining room table removed, donated to a church. I couldn't eat where they'd laughed at me, where they'd planned my destruction over my own cooking. I used part of the money to establish the Robert Thompson Foundation for Widows' Rights, specifically helping women facing financial abuse from their families. Catherine Walsh agreed to provide pro bono hours, saying my case had reminded her why she became a lawyer. Within the first year, we helped 12 women save their homes, their dignity, their futures from children and relatives who saw grief as opportunity. The garden flourished that spring like never before. Without the weight of their judgment, their false smiles and hidden resentments, everything seemed to grow fuller, reaching toward the sun with new purpose. I planted a rose bush where Robert's chair used to sit on the porch, deep red blooms that reminded me of lipstick and war and victory. Dorothy became my regular breakfast companion, fierce and funny at 91. "I never liked them," she confessed over pancakes one morning. "Robert knew it too. He once told me you were too good for his blood family, that you were the only real thing in his life. I think he'd be proud of how you fought." The neighbors, who'd witnessed the dramatic meeting, formed a protective circle around me. Mrs. Peterson brought casseroles. Mr. Johnson mowed my lawn without being asked. The church ladies invited me to join their book club, where we read murder mysteries and discussed them with knowing looks. I wasn't the widow they pitied anymore. I was the woman who'd fought back and won. 1 year after the trial, I stood in the cemetery with fresh flowers for Robert's grave. The headstone now read, "Robert Thompson, beloved husband, protector until the end." I told him about the foundation, about the women we'd helped, about the rose bush that bloomed like his love, beautiful but thorny enough to draw blood if handled carelessly. "You were right," I whispered to the stone. "I was stronger than I knew. But you should have trusted me with the truth. We could have fought them together." The wind rustled through the trees, and for a moment, I could swear I smelled his cologne, heard his voice saying what he'd said every morning for 45 years. "Morning, beautiful." I smiled, no longer the broken woman who'd discovered betrayal, but not the naive one who'd ignored it either. I was something new, a survivor who'd learned that sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money or property, but the strength to stand alone and win. 5 years have passed since that day in the lawyer's office when they laughed at me, calling me old woman, like it was an insult, like age and devotion were weaknesses to exploit. Now I'm 73, living in the same house Robert and I shared, but it's mine now in a way it never was before. Not because of the deed in my name, but because I fought for it, earned it twice over, with blood and tears and truth. This morning, I received a call from another widow, Rebecca, whose stepchildren were trying to contest her husband's will. She'd heard about my story through the foundation, her voice shaking as she described the familiar pattern, the sudden coldness after the funeral, the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered rooms, the lawyer meetings she wasn't invited to. I told her what I tell all of them. Document everything, trust your instincts, and remember the meek shall inherit the earth, but only if they're willing to fight for it. The garden is hosting a fundraiser next month for the foundation. We've helped 43 women now, each one a story of betrayal transformed into triumph. Some battles we've won in court, others through mediation, a few through the simple threat of exposure. It turns out that many families will reconsider their greed when faced with the possibility of public shame. Amazing how powerful truth becomes when you're willing to wield it like a weapon. I've learned that family is a word we define for ourselves. Blood makes you related, but loyalty, respect, and love make you family. The 3 children I raised, whom I loved with every fiber of my being for 45 years, they were never really mine. They were actors in a long play, and I was too blinded by love to see the performance. But the women who come to my foundation, the neighbors who stood by me, Catherine Walsh, who became an unlikely friend, Dorothy, who at 96 still comes for Tuesday tea, these are my family now. Chosen, not inherited, earned, not assumed. Robert's photograph sits on the mantel, and I talk to it sometimes, not with bitterness anymore, but with the honesty our marriage sometimes lacked. "You tried to protect me," I tell him, "but protection without truth is just another cage." He saved me financially, yes, but more importantly, his death freed me from the prison of being needed without being valued, used without being loved, present without being seen. The black box sits on my bookshelf now, empty but still important. Visitors often ask about it, this elegant velvet box displayed like a trophy. I tell them it once held evidence of betrayal and redemption, proof that sometimes the people who should love us most are capable of the greatest cruelty. But I also tell them it held something more, the key to finding my own strength, my own voice, my own worth that existed beyond being someone's wife, someone's stepmother, someone's servant. The moral of my story isn't simple or comforting. It's not that good always triumphs or that love conquers all. Sometimes good people get decades of deception as payment for their devotion. Sometimes love blinds us to the calculating nature of those we cherish. The real lesson is this: never let kindness make you weak. Never let sacrifice make you invisible. And never, ever let anyone convince you that your worth is determined by your usefulness to them. You might be wondering what you would do in my situation. Would you have seen the signs earlier? Would you have fought back or walked away quietly? Would you have forgiven them if they'd asked? But the better question is this: who in your life takes without giving, expects without appreciating, inherits without earning? And more importantly, what are you going to do about it today before it takes a death and a black box full of evidence to reveal the truth? Share your thoughts below, but more importantly, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who's being too patient, too understanding, too willing to accept crumbs when they deserve the whole feast. Sometimes the greatest act of love isn't sacrifice. It's refusing to be sacrificed. Remember, you're never too old to fight back, never too invested to walk away, and never, ever too insignificant to demand justice. The black box is empty now, but my life, finally, is full.